Welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! History with Joe Giorlando. In today's video, we are going to the summer of 2010 and taking a look at Herald of Perfection. I want to point out before getting into the introduction at large that this channel in its early infancy began a habit of naming videos based on the beginning of ban lists. And it's caused a little bit of a discrepancy due to the fact that Edison format has become such a popular retro format. I'm going to refer to this as March 2010 because that is technically the ban list in which this deck was played in. As a result of that confusion, sometimes when I've profiled decks in the summer of 2010, I've had individuals in the comments point out that this couldn't be played at Edison, which is absolutely the case. The Shining Darkness, which brought us Dark Soul, Bogart Knight, Infernity Launcher, Ronin Totem, Herald of Perfection are obviously game-breaking cards that are not legal at the SJC that took place in Edison. As a result of that, there's been a little bit of confusion with the month phrasing, but I'm pointing that out here at the beginning of the video. From the beginning of this channel through now, Edison has seen just this blossoming in popularity, which is fantastic, but it's made this little bit of a discrepancy in terms of the monthing, which I've used for naming. So I'm going to put that off to the side. I'm going to continue to refer to this as March 2010, acknowledging that this would not have been legal at Edison, but it does refer to the ban list that took place in which the Shining Darkness would be released and thus would be played under at the national season in 2010. With that being said, we're going to be taking a look at the national season, which I always imagine is a format where there are really three top decks that come to mind: Frog FTK, Infernities, and X-Sabers. And I think if you even to break it down even further than that, X-Sabers and Frog FTK are probably the best two decks. Herald of Perfection was always a rogue strategy. There was sometimes one in the top 32. It was a deck that wasn't played a ton, but it was definitely an option on the table for someone that wanted to approach the format from a very different direction. Herald of Perfection is essentially trying to establish Herald of Perfection on the field, ideally on the first turn, with as many fairies in hand as possible, a strategy that modern players might be familiar with something like Dry Drop. Back in the day, though, in 2010, what that actually looked like was to incorporate advanced ritual art in addition to a bunch of normal monsters. Advanced ritual art at this point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history was limited to one because it had been featured in previous decks. Demise at OTK namely comes to mind first. But with this particular deck, what we're trying to do is, instead of sending a bunch of insect monsters to summon Doomdozer with Demise King of Armageddon, we're going to be sending a bunch of fairy monsters, specifically Moki Moki, a level 1, Happy Lover, a level 2, and I will try my best to pronounce this during this video correctly, Gyakutena Magami, a level 6 fairy. And in doing so, it'll either fuel the graveyard with a bunch of normal monsters, utilizing level 1s and 2s with Happy Lover and Moki Moki, or just sending a level 6 to the graveyard right away. But by doing so, we fill our graveyard up for cards like Dark Factory of Mass Production and Pot of Avarice. In doing so, we can special summon Herald of Perfection and then immediately refuel our hand with fairy monsters, giving us a bunch of negates pretty quickly into the game. In addition to that, this deck is going to feature Archlord Christia, and by utilizing Herald of Perfection and Advanced Ritual Art, we can manipulate the quantity of fairies sent to the graveyard on the first turn, making it so that Archlord Christia is immediately live. The most ideal opening hand, if you were just to draw up this perfect scenario playing this deck, is to summon Herald of Perfection, summon Archlord Christia, and ideally beyond that, set Royal Decree. You open up those three, your opponent's not going to be able to beat you, especially in this time period. In addition to that, putting two fairies in your hand with Dark Factory might not seem like a ton. From a modern perspective, you might think, oh, I can just easily play through that. Back in the day when you're playing a deck with 15 normal summons, it's actually quite difficult to deal with a Herald of Perfection when the opponent has two fairies plus any other fairy that they happen to draw. So just opening Herald of Perfection with Dark Factory was usually enough to stymie their opening plays and make it so that you can start to draw into Pot of Avarice, Christia, more Dark Factories, and amass so many negates your opponent can't really beat you. When I do go into the deck profile, I will be sure to point out some of the lose conditions, because as a pilot of Herald of Perfection decks, you need to be keenly aware of the ways in which you could actually lose, because there were some very particular things that, for example, X-Sabers could do and other strategies to make it so that you actually had a lose condition. And one of the things with this deck, and I will point this out in the profile, if they ever did crack your field and deal with Herald of Perfection, this deck usually just lost, because that means you're going to be sitting there with a hand of normal monsters, and there really isn't much follow-up. Sometimes you could summon another Herald of Perfection, but usually if they dealt with the first one, chances are the second one's not going to be that great, because you Herald of Perfection maybe onto a field where your opponent has a XX-Saber Gothams who has so much attack they can just attack over a defense position Herald, and it doesn't really matter anyway. Without further ado, let's take a look at a Herald of Perfection deck that would have been legal during the 2010 national season. All right, first we'll start with the deck's namesake, which is, of course, Herald of Perfection. Herald of Perfection released in the Shining Darkness alongside Infernity Launcher, Dark Soul, Ronin Totem, and a few other cards like Bogart Knight, for example. Made it so that that set released 4 somewhat top-tier decks. I guess we could debate if Herald of Perfection is actually quite on that level. I don't think it was. but at least 3 absolutely top tier decks between X-Sabers, Infernities, and of course the various Frog decks. But Herald of Perfection was there, sort of on the fringes of a rogue strategy. Herald of Perfection, this deck's namesake. The entire deck basically revolves around summoning this on the first turn. In order to support Herald of Perfection, we have the most ideal card to pair it with on the opening turn, which is 3 copies of Archlord Christia. If you could go turn 1 Herald into Christia, it's very difficult for this deck to lose. And the way that Advanced Ritual Art works, you can send whatever the quantity of fairies necessary, which obviously is on the first turn going to be 4, but in the middle of the game, you can do some manipulating by sending only Happy Lovers and getting 3 sends. And if you already had a fairy in the graveyard, you can easily summon Christia, and then this deck has Pot of Avarice, Dark Factory, a bunch of ways of manipulating your fairy counts. You basically could always drop Christia as long as you were able to summon Herald of Perfection at some point in the game. Those are basically our boss monsters in this deck. From there, we're going to just find a bunch of ways of getting it onto the field. Herald, and then subsequently Christia. We have 3 copies of Manju. Manju just so happens to be a fairy monster, which is obviously fantastic. It makes it so that subsequent Manjus that you draw either allow you to summon a second Herald of Perfection, and I will eventually talk about why you'd want to do that, but also just give you fairies in hand for discards. This deck is, instead of Senju, going to play Sonic Bird. So Senju is a fairy monster, and your inclination would be to include it. But one of the reasons why often this deck did not include Senju is Herald of Perfection is the easiest one to search because you have 3 Manju, 3 Herald, and 3 Preparation of Right. Advanced Ritual Art, on the other hand, is limited to 1, so you actually needed to draw Manju, Sonic Bird, or just the single copy Advanced Ritual Art, or technically Dawn of the Herald. It just made it so there were less copies throughout the deck. If you added Senjus to the deck, it just ups the Herald count, giving you additional fairies. I mean, there's some debate there, but instead of going beyond 40 cards or making it so that there's just so many Herald of Perfection targets, by playing Sonic Bird and not playing Senju, it allows you to incorporate other cards in your deck that might actually help you win when Herald's on the field, because just because you got to Herald doesn't necessarily guarantee that you win, and I'll explain some of the lose conditions in this deck momentarily. This deck needs to play an abundance of normal monsters to support Advanced Ritual Art. This deck's going to play 3 copies of Moki Moki because it is the highest attack for a level 1 monster. It's basically the best fairy level 1 monster. And then 3 Happy Lovers. This card was literally 3 for 20 back in the day. It's actually still about that expensive as of the recording of this video. It's just the best level 2. Mystic Shinba only has 500 attack. This has 800 attack. So on the off chance that it ever actually mattered, which quite frankly it virtually never did, this was the best monster that you could play. This deck is, in addition to just playing the abundance of these level 1 and 2 normal monsters, going to play, I'll try to pronounce it, Gyakutenu Megami, because it's a level 6 fairy, making it so that with Advanced Ritual Art, you have a variety of options. You can send just a level 6, assuming that maybe you drew a bunch of these, and by doing that, you can at least put Herald on the field. Obviously, Herald with level 6, you can go 2 Happy Lovers and 2 Moki Mokis. You can actually, in addition to that, go 3 Happy Lovers, so you've got a few different ways of making it so that your Advanced Ritual Art can get a Herald of Perfection on the field. Obviously, if you draw multiple Happy Lovers, this cannot equal up to 6, so then you have to use Gyakutenu Megami, so it gives you that fallback plan, where if you did draw a bunch of Happy Lovers, you had a way of getting Herald of Perfection through Advanced Ritual Art, and not having to rely on Dawn of the Herald, which this deck actually plays as well. But those are our normal monsters. They also combo really well with, obviously, Dark Factory. For those of you who are familiar with this deck, you probably know that component. We'll talk about that when we get to the spells momentarily. The other cards are 2 copies of Honest, because it's limited to 2. It's also a fairy monster, which synergizes really well. In the situations you have to put Herald to attack mode, and I'll explain some of those situations in a little bit, it gives you an ability to shift Herald to attack mode and then have Honest in hand so that you can at least keep the Herald alive. The 1800 attack is somewhat more vulnerable than you'd want it to be. Of course, 2800 defense is fantastic, but if you do have to shift it to attack, that attack can be a vulnerability, and then all of a sudden your opponent can just attack over your Herald, so having Honest gives you a nice backup plan. It's also a really great card to get back with Christia. Then this deck is going to play 2 Herald of the Orange Lights. I'd say that this wasn't a default inclusion, but I think anyone that actually played this deck, once they lost enough games, they would start to consider, all right, how am I losing and what can I do to stop losing? And one of the lose conditions with this deck is allowing your opponent to wall you with a card like Pashul. Spirit Reaper's not super common, but technically that would qualify as well. At least with Pashul, your opponent has to pay the 1,000. It's a mandatory cost every turn. But it can give your opponent enough turns to draw out of it. There's a very particular thing that X-Sabers could actually do to out your field too if you didn't have Christia, which I'll talk about momentarily. Herald of the Orange Light just gives you the flexibility because, yes, it's a fairy. The biggest thing about it, though, is the fact that it is actually a tuner. When it's a tuner, it gives you the ability to use your extra deck, and then honestly, if you can go Herald plus just about anything powerful from your extra deck, that locks out most of the things your opponent can do to beat you. I'll explain some of that in just a little bit when we get to some of the decks in the format, but having tuners in your deck was really, really, really critical. It also gives you some resistance going second against the Frog FTK, making it so that you can suddenly out of the blue just negate Substitute. Your opponent might not anticipate that. At YCS Indianapolis, I actually played this deck and used Hanawada in the main deck, which is a similar role to Herald of the Orange Light. In retrospect, I think this was just better, but Hanawada made it so that you couldn't get Mass Drivered out, and it also was a tuner and fit some of those slots about needing to go into the extra deck. In retrospect, I just think playing multiple Herald was just strictly better because it's better against all the other matchups, but it does give you a little bit of a surprise factor if you're going second, and in the fact that it is a tuner, it's really important for what this deck is trying to do, giving you a few different types of hand traps at a point in time where there wasn't a lot of hand traps. But that's the big monster lineup. All right, so with the spell lineup, as I was just mentioning, if your opponent can combine Herald with a card like Dark Factory, it can be really difficult to beat them. Dark Factory allows you to take any of your normal monsters that you have into the graveyard and add them to your hand, except Yakutena Megami, I should point out, you can't use that one, but any 2 or lower monsters, which means obviously Moki Moki and Happy Lover qualify. Then you have 3 copies of Pot of Avarice. A lot of people play 2. I have 3 here. You know, Pot of Avarice can manipulate your graveyard for Christia. It also can just fuel your hand with normal monsters, which is really important, or just any fairy, quite frankly. So I have 3 copies of Pot of Avarice. I have 3 copies of Preparation of Right. Getting back Advanced Ritual Art is a pretty important component of this deck's long game when your opponent decides to kind of play through it. If your opponent is witty about how to play against this deck, you definitely want to be able to access a second Herald of Perfection, because the fact that it's level 6 can be pretty useful when you combine it with a tuner. And sometimes, although you have Herald of Perfection on the field, you need to be able to summon your Herald of Orange Light and have a non-tuner on the field in order to go into your extra deck to kind of lock out some of your lose conditions, and being able to get back Advanced Ritual Art, and then perhaps Advanced Ritual Art just Magama to the graveyard so that there's the level 6. Now you have Herald on the field, and now you can go into level 8 Synchro with your Herald of Perfection, or Herald of Orange Light rather. It's actually pretty important. In addition to that, it just in the early game lets you tutor out Herald of Perfection, which is, you know, obviously what this deck is trying to do. We have a copy of Giant Trunade, specifically Giant Trunade, not Heavy Storm. I'll actually explain why Giant Trunade is the important one to play in the version that I'm profiling. A copy of Dawn of the Herald. This is just included because if you happen to draw double Happy Lover and Megami, you actually wouldn't otherwise be able to use Advanced Ritual Art. This does give you that out where you can activate this and just use the level 6 from your hand and then go into Herald of Perfection that way. It also makes it so that if Advanced Ritual Art hits the graveyard, you do have a second copy of a ritual, because Advanced Ritual Art is limited to 1 in this deck, or at least in this format, and therefore we only can play 1 copy. It does give us a backup plan. You know, Solemn Judgment is also in the format, and if you don't have Giant Trunade or your own copy of Solemn Judgment or your Royal Decree, this hitting the graveyard can be really bad. Granted, you do have this. There are ways of recycling it, but you just want to have as many rituals as possible when you are limited to only 1 single copy here. Plus you have these 3, plus you have Dawn, right? It just gives you a nice flexibility there, where some of the games you might otherwise lose, you have got these sort of backdoor outs to get into a Dawn of the Herald and then still put Herald of Perfection on the field. For the Trop lineup, there are 2 copies of Royal Decree, because you only can play 2 copies of Royal Decree, 2 copies of Royal Oppression. What Oppression does is it gives you sort of a backdoor way of going, you know, the ideal way is just to go Christia, Herald of Perfection, because then your Christia is an attack mode, and you're just going to attack over everything and eventually beat your opponent. If you open Royal Oppression, Herald of Perfection, Royal Oppression plus Herald of Perfection, I guess it is kind of Herald of Oppression, but you open up both of those, it can be very difficult for your opponent to beat you, because obviously the Oppression is going to lock out any of the special summons that would go over the top of the 2800 defense. It does make it, though, so that in the long run, if your opponent does wall you up a little bit, it's going to be difficult for you to actually start attacking, because the Oppression is going to shut off your ability to put an additional Herald of Perfection on the field, and then you're just going to be stuck there with a 2800 defense monster, which is why having a copy of Giant Trunade is really important, because if you do Oppression early, you can eventually draw into Trunade, put this back to your hand, conduct a special summon, whether that's a Christia or a Synchro monster, and then reestablish Oppression, and then there you're going to be able to win the game. But one of the ways this deck can lose is if your opponent brick walls you with a big defense monster, and make it so that you have to shift your Herald of Perfection to attack mode, and then you're vulnerable if you haven't drawn into Honest. So there's a little bit of a lose condition there, and you want to have cards like this in the deck with a Trunade, because 1 Trunade can just be pretty solid opening up the back row. But in addition to that, it lets you reset your Oppression. And then 1 copy of Solemn Judgment. One of the lose conditions that this deck has is against Gladiator Beasts. Chariot can be really difficult to play through. So having a Solemn Judgment in your deck just gives you a little bit of play through there as you're trying to dig into Decree. Once you establish Decree with Herald, you're good against that deck. But until then, that's one of your lose conditions. And Solemn Judgment's it's a generically good card. In terms of the extra deck, so as I mentioned, you do go into the extra deck The fact that you have Moki Moki, Happy Lover, a bunch of the level 6s, you actually have a variety of levels that you can go into. So we're just going to have a really robust array. Armor Elm is important because you can equip it to a Spirit Reaper, just in case. Time isn't that big of a deal, but with this deck, it could be. It's somewhat difficult to actually get this particular level, right? If you use Herald of the Orange Light, I mean, yes, you could have a Moki Moki and a Happy Lover on the field, but that's a lot of monsters your opponent could otherwise just be attacking. But there is an Android here. Same thing with Catastor. This one is a little bit more likely because you have the Manju and the Sonic Bird, so level 6 is actually fairly important. Bryonix is actually pretty important too because you can basically Bryo lock against X-Sabers. One of the things that X-Sabers specifically could do back in the day against this deck is they could actually attack over. Any deck could do this, but the deck that could do it the most likely were decks like Blackwings and decks like X-Sabers, because what those decks try to do to actually out your Herald of Perfection is put a monster on the field without activating an effect that has over 2,800 attack. So what X-Sabers could do is they could go, have Pashul, the pretend is the Pashul, go normal summon Airbellum, special Faltro, and immediately go into a level 9 synchro with the Faltro and the Airbellum, and that's Gotems. And then if your opponent summons Gotems, it's really difficult for you to win. You basically have to have Honest in hand, because they did that entire thing without actually activating an effect, because they're not going to use their Faltro effect, you'd negate it with Herald of Perfection. What the Bryo lock would sometimes allow you to do is the only way that X-Sabers could do that is if they were allowed to set a Pashul and it survives because it stays on the field. But if you just Bryo bounce the Pashul every turn, they can never actually get 2 X-Sabers on the field without triggering an effect, because they'd have to otherwise use something like Bogart Knight or Gotem's Emergency Call. And under either of those conditions, you can just negate it, destroy it outright, and then your opponent just outright loses. So there are some conditions where you're just trying to avoid the very particular ways that you lose. So Bryonix is really important because you can Bryo lock the X-Saber deck and make it so they never have a chance to go into Gotems. But there's Bryo. It also gives you outs to an extent to cards like Spirit Reaper. Ancient Sacred Wyvern, your deck is all light monsters. Black Rose Dragon, Ancient Wyvern, Ancient Fairy Dragon, rather. That's a light monster. You're never really going into any of these, but they're there. Thought Ruler, Archfiend, Stardust. Red Dragon can be somewhat important too if you have to deal with something like a Spirit Reaper. Colossal Fighter, Revenge Knight Parshath, Mistworm, and I put a Chimera Tech in here, even though I don't elect to play Cyber Dragon anywhere. Again, yes, these all matter, but they matter under such particular circumstances, and as long as you have the outs to cards like Spirit Reaper, cards like Pashul, you're pretty fine. Once you have these 3, you're basically covering almost all of the lose conditions, plus, you sprinkle a few other ones here or there as you might need them. So I put a Chimera Tech in there because, why not? In terms of the top decks this format, of course, you had Frog FTK, which we're going to use a Death Frog to represent. We have X-Saber decks. We have Infernity decks. We have Frog Monarchs. The Mirror Match, Glads, which I would say is a really difficult matchup because of the existence of Chariot. And then we have some Blackwing decks. I guess I could also theoretically put in something like Caliber Cat, but I didn't really respect Caliber Cat too much. But these are the primarily the top decks, or some of the decks you can anticipate playing against at the 2010 Nationals. In terms of the side deck, so the thing about this deck is it's so geared towards a very particular game plan, it's actually hard to have a really great side deck. One of the cards that you could consider playing was Consecrated Light. Most of the players that played Herald used this because in theory it's really good against Infernities. Technically it's pretty good against Blackwings too. It also just happens to be a light monster, not that the fact that it's a fairy monster. It's a light monster too, so you could, honest it. Not that you really necessarily want to, because there's no attack itself. But it is a fairy, so there is some flexibility there. Hanawata is another card that's a fairy. It actually is a tuner. I pointed that out a moment ago, where you could technically play this over the Herald of the Orange Light if you wanted to specifically gear yourself towards having it out to Mass Driver. But technically, if you drew this, if it was just Herald of the Orange Light, you could just negate the substitute. Chances are you're going to win the game anyway through that. So you didn't necessarily need it to be specifically Hanawata, but you theoretically could if you wanted additional ways of countering Frog FTK. Then we have 3 copies of Giorlando. This is another fairy. The reason why Giorlando is in the deck is actually for the Mirror Match. As you may have heard me point out, one of the ways of beating this particular deck is putting a monster on the field that can't be destroyed by battle and just stalling for a little while. This deck has outs, as I commented on, by incorporating tuners. We can get around it, but if you only have a couple tuners in your deck, this isn't modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Where you can just tutor it out whenever you need it. You needed to just eventually draw into it, and that could sometimes take a while. So a card like Giorlando can make it so that you get to just compile a bunch of cards, and one of the ways of trying to beat Herald of Perfection is to overload the negates. What I mean by that is this deck is limited, at least on your turn, to 6 negates by having a handful of fairies. If you could play a deck where you could just incorporate enough potential cards your opponent needed to negate by setting cards and then on your turn, flipping a bunch, using a bunch from your hand, you might be able to overload the 6 negates. Giorlando just gives you an out to kind of stall, and it's also a fairy monster. Not the greatest card, but it's definitely something you have to side out cards like Royal Decree anyway, so it does give us at least something in the mirror match. I have 2 copies of Wave Motion Cannon and a copy of Heavy Storm, because it also kind of gives you some flexibility in the mirror match, right? You just play Wave Motion Cannon. Your opponent's not going to be a really happy person if that happens. Heavy Storm just gives you some flexibility if you have to go second, which could sometimes happen. And then there's 3 copies of Mask of Restrict. I was actually struggling. I got down, I put these 9 in there because I felt like they're just fairy monsters. They made the most sense. When I played this deck back in the day, I used to use these. The other cards were kind of difficult to come up with. I kind of liked these, and then I figured Mask of Restrict, because Frog FTK in retrospect was probably the best deck, and it gives you just a ton of resistance, right? If you have one of those hands where you have to go Manju, search a piece, pass, and you didn't actually open both pieces to summon Herald of Perfection, Frog FTK can literally just kill you, so having this can make it so you have a little bit of resistance there. Even if they do block you, you're probably not in good shape, so having Mask of Restrict just gives you additional resistance there, plus it's good against, of course, the Monarch variants. But in terms of how this deck lost, there's a few different things. I commented on Gothams. I commented on some of the other lose conditions. The fact that Herald of Perfection isn't the modern day one where it can just negate anything made it so that if your opponent could put a monster on the field with more attack than its defense, you could attack over it and then never get a negate. And usually this was one of those sort of House of Cards style decks where if your opponent could crack Herald, you basically lost on the spot. You had a little bit of follow-up, but sometimes you just never drew the Dark Factories. Sometimes you just never drew Pot of Avarice specifically. So you didn't have the ability to even summon another Herald, and you would just lose outright. So it was definitely one of those decks where you needed to play the entire game knowing how you could potentially lose. The mistake, having played this deck a bunch during this format, is that a lot of people just didn't know how to play against it, so they would just make really silly mistakes. For example, you don't want to go top deck Smashing Ground, activate Smashing Ground, I go negate, and you go pass. You didn't really accomplish anything because I'm just going to eventually draw into more fairies. You needed to wait, draw all your Smashing Grounds, set all your Smashing Grounds, draw all your Book of Moons, set all your Book of Moons, and then on one turn you should go Book of Moon, negate. Okay, Book of Moon, you need to negate again. Activate Smashing Ground, you have to negate. Activate Smashing Ground again, you negate. And then eventually make it so that by utilizing your set cards and utilizing all the cards in your hand, you were able to blast through the Herald of Perfection. Now, if this deck drew Decree and it drew Christia and it drew Herald of Perfection, there's not much you can do. But there were ways of beating this deck that a lot of people that I remember playing against never really exploited. But by playing this deck and knowing some of your lose conditions with Gothams and knowing the defense threshold of Herald of Perfection, you could usually avoid some of those situations. I will point out with specifically Glads, I considered putting 7 Tools, a card I never actually played back in the day, but Chariot is another absolutely backbreaking lose condition. Unfortunately, in that matchup, you really just have to turbo into Decree and just hope to get there. Or summon Christia with Decree and not even go into Herald of Perfection, because the fact that you can just Chariot Herald of Perfection is just absolutely game-breaking. It makes it so that that was by far the worst matchup, but most of these other matchups are pretty winnable. But nevertheless, that's Giorlando for Yu-Gi-Oh! History. Thank you for watching. Check back soon for plenty more Yu-Gi-Oh! content.